Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, wherever you're joining from, and welcome to Wisdom Wednesdays. My name is Belinda Newham, and I'm the founder of WiSDM, which is Women in Strategic Decision Making. I want to start today by acknowledging that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Ngunnawal people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all join today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing culture and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. So WiSDM, Women in Strategic Decision Making, is a community aiming to grow the number of women in strategic decision making and provide support to women decision makers. We know that diversity of opinion is key to achieving great outcomes in decisions that matter. We're committed to having women represented and supported in decision-making roles. We share experiences, build best practice, and provide a pathway for women decision makers of the future. WiSDM identify gaps and obstacles that make it hard for women to participate in strategic decisions and create momentum around these issues to affect change. We seek to educate and inspire others to take action and welcome people of all gender identities in our community. I'd really like to invite you today to introduce yourself in the chat box. Let us know where you're joining from. And if you've got what brought you here, an aspiration or a thought you have for women in strategic decision making. And I know my guests today, and I'll be sure to get to as many of those comments and questions as possible. Welcome, Paul. Thanks for introducing yourself there. As has become the custom with WiSDM, I'd like to start our session with the WiSDM Wrap. So the WiSDM Wrap for the fortnight ending the 11th of August. This is where we get present to some of the recent highlights for women in strategic decision making, take note of the gaps and obstacles, and identify where we can have impact. So the first thing I want to mention is last week's announcement of Christine Holgate receiving $1 million payout from Australia Post. So you'll remember that the Australia Post has agreed to pay Christine Holgate $1 million as a termination payment after mediation before a federal court judge. They've also agreed to pay some money towards her legal costs. In a statement, Australia Post has said that it lost an effective CEO following the events of the morning of 22 October 2020, and it regrets the difficult circumstances surrounding her departure. So, you know, the saga started last year in a Senate Estimates Committee where Ms. Holgate told the hearing that 4 Cartier watches had been given to senior executives as a reward for work. And at the time she said it was a recommendation from the chair that people were rewarded, and they are a commercial organisation. So the revelation became a political issue immediately, and within hours the Prime Minister had told Parliament he was appalled and the gifts were disgraceful. Ms. Holgate was forced to step aside and eventually she chose to resign. She has said, "The simple truth is I was bullied out of my job. I was humiliated and driven to despair. I was thrown under the bus so the chairman of Australia Post could curry favour with his political masters." And earlier this year, a government investigation confirmed no indication of dishonesty, fraud, corruption, or intentional misuse of Australia Post funds by any individual involved in the matters relating to the purchase and gifting of Cartier watches. Well, just something I wanted us to be present to in terms of the landscape for women in strategic decision making currently. Another was a study that I came across, which was published earlier this year by Reuters Institute, and it's analysing the gender breakdown of top editors in media globally. So it looked at a strategic sample of 240 major online and offline outlets across 12 different markets in 4 continents. Unfortunately, Australia is not one of those, but still relevant for us to look at this. So we know in media organisations, top editors are important because they're key figures leading the newsroom direction and decision-making, shaping what news and newsrooms look like. And they also play a role in the relationship between journalists and audiences. So the research found that 22% of the 180 top editors across the brands they looked at were women, 22%. And on average, this is substantially below the 40% of journalists who are women in those same markets. So the conclusion they made was they found no clear interpretable relationship between overall gender equality in society and the percentage of women among top editors, which is underlining that there are specific dynamics at play and in the news media. I'll send links to that study to you as well. The third thing to mention is August is Women's Month in South Africa. So I came across an article in the Daily Maverick, which is an independent media outlet in South Africa, which is looking at how the status of South African women has evolved in the past decade, from home ownership to employment and debates around land tenure. So women are actually leading home ownership data in that country, and data showing that over the last 10 years, female first-time home applications increased by 52%, with a decline of 5.9% for male applications. So the interesting thing there is it differs notably from the overarching reality that women in general are earning lower incomes than men, which is limiting their access to the property market. Employment rates, this is still in South Africa, employment rates in March 2021, women 43.8% employed and men 60.2%. So interestingly though, in that data, women occupied 1 in 3 managerial positions and 49% of professionals were female. And when it comes to their directors on their JSE listed companies, 20.7% of directors were female. So while not the focus of the decision-making aspect of our commitment here, a stark reminder in the research was that 1 in 3 women in South Africa are victims of domestic violence. And according to the World Health Organization, South Africa's femicide rate is almost 5 times higher than the global average. The fourth thing I'd like to mention, and I'm not sure if she's on today, but she has been a previous guest of ours, is Dr. Susan McGinty has been recognised as one of 20 in Australian Business Journal's pick of 20 best leadership experts and coaches to watch out for in 2021. So she's been recognised for her commitment to changing the status quo for women as leaders by uplifting more women into leadership roles and through building the skills needed to be an exceptional leader. So congratulations to Susan, and it's great to have you part of this community. And the last announcement is one specifically from me. This week I received the certification for WiSDM to be officially recognised as an incorporated association. So basically that means more opportunity to impact the women in strategic decision making. And I'll be making more announcements in the coming weeks about this exciting development and our plans to provide more support for women decision makers, which is all being created inside your participation in activities like WiSDM Wednesday. And I'd like to just give a special shout out in the incorporation there to Catalyze, my employer, who's really supported me both financially and given me the time and space to create WiSDM. And without them, we wouldn't have the association or even be here today. So thank you. And that is the WiSDM wrap. So don't forget to please send me your news stories throughout the fortnight, because I'd love to feature them in this session. Now on to WiSDM Wednesdays. The intent for these sessions, the WiSDM Wednesdays, is to showcase different women and their experiences in strategic decision making in order to shape the direction of WiSDM and our collective aims. So far in this series, we've heard from women in fields like national security, advanced analytics, consulting and coaching, and with experience including boards, advisory, partner, general manager, and founder. And today is going to be no different. We have a truly exceptional woman who's going to share her experiences and also some great research findings with us. So Carolyn, would you like to turn on your video? I'd love to see you as I introduce you. Hi, Carolyn. So Carolyn is the founder and managing director of 6Ps Marketing and Engagement, an organisation committed to improving the quality of decision-making by creating business intelligence tools founded in neuroscience. Carolyn works with leaders to apply critical thinking in areas such as customer, brand, employee, culture, governance, and leadership. She's also the founder of Validate Innovations and the People and Science, Psychological Safety and Performance Benchmarks, which is where we want to go to today, and Business Intelligence Tools. She's the author of a number of books and the Skills Competency Framework for Legacy Leadership. She's got a keen focus on emerging research and applications of organisational neuroscience, and she's seeking to optimise the performance of teams and driving customer advocacy as the 2 leading indicators of sustainable competitive advantage. And one of the things we are going to talk to Carolyn today about is her brand new research. But first, let's welcome you. Hello.
Hello. That's so good.
Welcome. And thank you. And,
myself.
You should be impressed with yourself. I'm glad you had that experience, because I'm impressed when I read and every time I've interacted with you in the last few weeks in particular. So today, no different. Before we get stuck into the bulk of the discussion today around your research, I'd really love to just have everyone get to know you a bit more. So I'd really like to hear what your personal experience of women in strategic decision making is.
I've had some great mentors in this, and I don't know if she's here. I haven't had a look. But one of my earliest recollections and probably greatest mentor really early on was Babette Ben-Susan, who did a lot of work in competitive intelligence. And I happened to be working with an energy company at the time whose, let's say, decision-making wasn't as strategic as it could be. But one of the best decisions they made was to get external input. And Babette was one of those consultants that came in. And that, of course, just sent me on a whole new, career opportunity and learning just around competitive intelligence for a number of years, and just watching her in her space and reading a lot of the material that she was producing. So that was probably one of the earlier experiences I had in actually understanding and informing myself more around some of the strategic inputs, around decision making and certainly in terms of competitive intelligence. And that was when I was working at Ergon Energy in a senior management role in customer, working with large end of the energy competitors and just before contestability. So that was a really good experience as well. And then I guess when I started working for myself, I started mentoring with a lot of organisations just so I could keep up to date with some of their challenges with the Queensland government. And that got me onto a number of board positions. And then since then, I've probably reduced the number of board positions and instead looking at advisory board positions.
Great. Okay. So yeah, lots of, as I suspect, lots of really relevant experience for us here, both as a business owner, someone who's in a managerial position in a corporate organisation, and then now also in the board positions. So it might be hard for you to pick one or two of those, but I'd love to hear about in all those kind of backgrounds that you mentioned, a strategic decision that's impacted you and sticks in your mind, something that you were part of or perhaps you wanted to be part of and weren't.
Probably the most the one that always comes up and resonates with me the most was really early in my career. I was working for a manufacturing industry and I was on the leadership team, and I remember getting reprimanded in this manufacturing meeting because I was very new and I dared to ask a question of the head of manufacturing, and to this day I still actually don't know what the question was or why it was so, but I had to ring and apologise after the meeting because I asked a question in this meeting. And at the time we were doing a whole lot of research, a lot of blue sky research around a particular product before launch, and we had a great deal of money and expenditure on that decision. But we had to get final sign-off by the chief of engineer of manufacturing. And in the end, despite all evidence to the contrary saying we needed to actually develop a new mold in it to do a new product, his decision was, you know what, we've got molds, these ones will do, that would cost us $30,000 to do a new mold and we're not going to do that. And at the time we were getting really significant pressure from a lot of imports, and we really needed to grab the market in this really emerging trend that was happening with a lot of units being developed and things like that. So despite all evidence to the contrary to proceed with this new product, they decided to actually use an old product and just rebrand it, and it had significant impacts on the business, a lot of wasted money, but the potential would have been millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah. So that's very interesting. And that decision to go with the existing product supported across the business, or, kind of how was that made in a way that had people along for the journey? Or?
Do you know, I think it was a little bit of defensive decision-making there in terms of we'd just come out of an industrial strike. So, we had a lot of different competing attentions for time, I guess, and resources. But I think at the end of the day, it came down to one person making the decision over all evidence to the contrary. And I think that ended up being the biggest impact, that we had or a select few that were making that decision as opposed to it being a wider one. But what was really critical to me is the ability for us to ignore facts and evidence as part of that decision making and go with you know what, it's a resource issue and we just don't want to do it. The impacts on time and effort would just be too much, or, you know, cost in terms of millions and millions of dollars in opportunity, you know, $30,000 to create a new mold at a time. I was going, I don't understand. I'm not quite understanding this decision.
Yeah, how interesting. So it sounds like there's some real kind of weighting of the risk over what the potential benefits were in that situation, and, you know, how often in decision making that occurs when we're not even present to it. So it's a great example. So, and yes, not happy about you having to email to apologize to your senior, which is I can only imagine that was one of the many seeds that had you sort of really getting interested in this idea of psychological safety and what opportunities that provides for organizations when you have, you know, that environment.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and in all of these experiences that I've had in my career, I've been in real male-dominated industries: manufacturing, energy, banking, finance. So majority of the time, I am the one of two women usually sitting at that boardroom table.
Interesting. Well, I think when we get into your research and white paper, we're going to hear more about how some of the tips for managing those sorts of situations. So let's get into that. So I'm just going to introduce what the research is, Carolyn, and so that we're all kind of present to it. And the Boardroom Psychological Safety and Performance Benchmark, which you conducted, sought to gain insights into the psychological safety of the Australian boardroom. So to identify what factors are impacting psychological safety and the impacts on the quality of decision-making and organisational psychological safety. So the benchmarking survey of 623 Australian board members and executive leaders was conducted over 2020 and 2021. And it's just been published, literally hot on the press. Yes. So just as a heads up for today, Carolyn has agreed to provide this information. So when we're talking about today, I'm going to give you some details afterwards so you can get in contact with Carolyn and get copies of the data and the reporting. That's right, isn't it? Yeah, which is so great. So thank you, because I know this is something you have self-funded. So it's really generous of you to provide that to this community and also to provide your time today to talk it through. So let's start right at the start, because psychological safety, I know I have an availability bias now because we're talking about it, but I see it everywhere. So it's popping up all over the place for me. And so I'm really interested in what actually is it? Step aside from the buzzword, what do we mean when we say psychological safety?
Yeah, look, good question. I think one of the things that we need to do is probably get some agreed meaning around it, because a lot of people immediately think, oh, it's mental health, and this becomes a mental health issue, but it's actually the precursor to that. It's much more, it's very different. So I love Dr. Timothy Clark's definition of it because he breaks it down really, really simple stages. So I'll borrow his terminology, but you know, he defines it as being 4 stages. One is that you actually feel included, you feel like you're part of a team. The second one is that you actually feel safe to learn, so you feel safe to ask questions and to ask for help. The third is that you actually feel safe to contribute and participate, so you're able to give opinions, you're able to voice issues, raise issues, but in particular you actually feel like you can contribute safely. And the fourth one is that you're able to challenge the status quo, so you're able to problem solve and show initiative. But you only have psychological safety in that environment if you actually don't have any fear of being embarrassed, of being humiliated, of being told, you know, put on the carpet, or that later on that you might be punished by missing out on projects or missing out on promotions or pay potentially. So really it's about feeling safe and being in an environment where you're actually welcomed and appreciated and valued in terms of that input.
Great, that's a great definition. And I guess what my next question is probably a bit of a bit provocative, I suppose, but kind of, so what? Why do organisations need to care about it? You know, what about our, you know, what is there a relationship between that environment and decision making?
Good question. So I think that the so what is on many different on many different levels. The first is that if we're actually looking at high performing teams, then we need to have the environment that's going to make it so that people feel like they can speak up, that they feel like they can challenge, that you have diversity of opinion, of thought, of experience, but there's no point having that if they feel like they can't share that and that we can't actually act on that. So if we want high performing teams where they're actually doing their best, they're in flow modes all the time, or majority of the time, then we need to have that environment that is actually conducive to that. The second one is that it's probably our greatest potential for risk. So in the last 12 months, we've had pretty much all states agree to actually have a really big focus on psychosocial hazards in the workplace health and safety regulatory environment. So that's actually going to provide a lot of impetus, I think, for businesses to actually look at it a lot closer, because the reputational risk, the personal risk is going to be significant. And from all intents and purposes, they're saying this is as important, if not more important than physical safety, just due to the actual implications of it in terms of our loss of economic benefits, in terms of our mental health and what it's costing the industry and what it's costing people, suicide rates, things like that. That's how it actually, looks like at the end if we haven't done something at the beginning.
Great, thank you. And specifically around the relationship with psychological safety and decision making, I know that's something you explored in the research. Can you tell us some of the findings in that regard?
Yeah, so that was a really we'll probably talk more about my process and just how scattergun it seems to be, but yeah, we found a positive correlation definitely between psychological safety and decision making on boards, which is what we wanted to do. And when I say on boards, I mean within the boardroom, so leadership teams, executive leadership teams, and boards and committees. So it was a positive 6.3%, positive 6.3 correlation, which was great. And a little bit to be expected, I think, and probably will be stronger, and that might be more around the questioning, but we could definitely see that what we did is we had everyone assess themselves what that quality of decision making was. So for example, they were the ones that were able to determine if they believed that their quality of decision making was highly effective, moderately effective, somewhat effective, or lowly. So I didn't go in and actually assess that. We allowed them to self-assess. And what we did is we compared that with the levels of psychological safety, where they rated it on a 0 to 10 across a number of those factors that we discussed before. And what we found is, of course, that those that had low psychological safety also evaluated the quality of their decision making as not effective or not very effective, whereas those who rated high on psychological safety, they rated their decision making as being highly effective.
Right. Interesting. And of course, I am interested in the word decision quality, and I'm glad you mentioned that it's a self-assess, because I think that's an interesting part too. And of course, I'd love to talk to you, Sarah. I'd love to think about kind of how what's in people's mind when they're thinking about the quality of their own decision making as well, because this is obviously, there's a nice little juncture there. So, I mean, you shared with me some of the the research before. Thank you for doing that. So I know that you had some key reasons why, some of the factors that were really driving the psychological safety, I suppose, and what was impacting those low quality decision making things. Did you want to talk about some of those and just kind of unpack them a little bit?
Yeah. Look, what was interesting is that overall we said to people, how would you rate your the quality of decision making you have around your strategic decisions? And only 25% said our decisions are highly effective. And that was when we asked that was in relation to actually achieving their strategic goals. When we said to them, right, when you look at your strategic goals in terms of your people and culture, that highly effective dropped to about 15%. So then we said to them, how personally effective do you believe that you are in the decision making? That was at around 35%. So there was I think a fairly good assessment of their belief of that quality of decision making. So then when we asked them, well, what are some of the contributing factors to that around the boardroom table? So many of them really looked like the same contributing factors to psychological safety. So just looking at some of those, motivation, for example, a lot of people actually said, 41% said, look, we actually believe that people are putting the goals of the organisation before their personal drivers. So there was a real question mark over what people were prioritizing around the table, if it was personal or if it was organizational. The level of respect, so 39% said that there was and what we asked was the majority of time around the table. So the majority of time, 39% people thought that there was mutual respect shown and demonstrated around the table. Trust levels, though, were quite low at, almost, I think, 2 out of 10 had high to very high trust levels around the table. But one of the biggest ones that I thought was interesting was only 29% thought that they actually shared information and knowledge around that table, and that led to only about 17% believing that they were actually informed prior to making a decision. And the other one were the structures and processes, which were only around 8%, saying that, yeah, we believe that our structures and processes around within the boardroom are actually enabling us to make good decisions, but also driving that accountability. And the other one, which was more of, in terms of mindset and in terms of mutual respect, was that only 14% actually felt valued, that they actually had their strengths optimized around the table, that they, in this case, I think there was a real difference between sitting at the table and actually being valued and contributing at the table, and instead of it being just a ticking a box type of experience.
Yeah, that's, interesting, and certainly the experience that's been shared in previous weeks from other guests has been, I think some of the previous sessions have been, it's time to move past you've got a seat at the table, we need to do more than that. I think that might have been, what Joanna was talking about last week with the, environments that allow us to sort of thrash the decision out. I liked, as you said, the unclear roles and responsibilities as part of that process one. I know that in your foundings, you had only about half were clear on the roles and responsibilities. I thought that was clear around the table.
Yeah, absolutely. That 30% alignment. And I have to say that has been something that I've seen since COVID, that there has been a lot more engagement in organisations trying to go back to the drawing board and really look at their position and what their value is and what the competitive information is that's coming in, but also what are our customers actually demanding, as well as the environment that we're dealing with. But yeah, 30% was quite low, and it's really being demonstrated down through the organisation too, because I think when we had a look, we asked some of the middle management and some of the frontline teams, what they believed or what their level of trust is of those decisions coming from the board, and there was only about a 36% that said that we actually trust the decisions coming from the top. So that has a really, really big impact. So in terms of psychological safety, what we found is pretty much only 4 in 10 people feel psychologically safe around the table where they feel like they can speak up. So that's having a really great impact on that dynamic around the decision-making table. Yeah.
And then when you correlated that with the quality of the decision-making self-assessment, that's where you found that. That's right. Yeah. And so you talked a bit about trust there. I'm interested because I think trust and psychological safety often, they can be used a bit interchangeably. So kind of what is, and I know in your paper you sort of set out quite clearly the distinction between them. What is kind of that role of trust in creating psychological safety?
Yeah, look, I think you definitely need to have trust, but it's only one factor that actually contributes to psychological safety. So I think where trusting somebody is actually as a relationship that you have with somebody else, psychological safety and the levels of trust within that psychological safety is more about how much that you actually trust the environment that you're in to actually support your decision making. So it's more about the group dynamic as opposed to an individual dynamic. And that's where the importance is really, but we need to have trust to actually obviously build the cohesion amongst that team and to be able to drive some of that psychological safety.
Yeah, and I remember you mentioned just before the disparity with the trust within the, that boardroom environment. So, and then I know you said you looked at other layers in the organisation. What was kind of the trust like throughout?
Yeah, so with trust, I'm going to have to look at my little notes.
Oh yeah,
here.
Sorry,
there's so many figures, and we'll talk about this later. I'm so not a figures person, which is kind of hilarious. Me moving into this.
Don't invalidate yourself now. You are.
Yeah, that's right. It's so so with the trust, when we looked at the leadership teams, there was only 26% indicated that they had high levels or high levels or very high levels of trust. When we compared that to the rest of the teams, I think it was almost 3 times that. So almost 6 out of 10 as opposed to the 2 out of 10. Yeah.
So as you went through the organisation, the trust, I remember when you were talking to me about previously, the trust was kind of eroding the further up you went in the organisation.
Absolutely, yeah. So we looked at leadership teams where 2 out of 10 actually trust each other. By the time we got down to the bottom, it was more 6 out of 10. So so they were doing a lot better.
But the distrust from the middle management up to the leadership team was also, no trust there, or less relative trust. Yeah. It's interesting because I think that goes to me when I look at that from a decision-making perspective, a bit like the example you shared right at the start from your personal experience. When there's a perception of leaders that can't be trusted making decisions that impact all of us and we're not, part of it, we being the, say the middle management and the teams responsible for implementing, it's not hard to see why those decisions don't stick and why they don't, come out successful if they've not been, if there's a level of distrust and also they're not part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. When we went into organisations with the psychological safety assessment tool, one of the things we look at is, of course, their engagement. And so when they know that they're working on things where it's actually having very little impact on what they perceive the goals and the strategic priorities of the business that they should be, we're losing engagement at a significant rate, and there's a lot of discontent. So that's probably one way that from a perspective of looking at some lagging indicators, because what we've been saying too is that psychological safety is this lead indicator. So if there's one thing that you should be looking at from a board perspective around your people and your culture and what your growth opportunities are, have a look at psychological safety. By the time we look at engagement, it's too late. Too late. So when we've got people that are misaligned in their strategy and they're not trusting the decisions from above, then we're getting a great deal of disengagement at the lower levels and through our teams and through the front line. But the other thing that's happening is that there is just this really common misalignment anyway of here we have a strategy but we don't know how to implement it, and that's what we're seeing really, really common, that we may have tried to determine and when we think we've nailed our purpose and we think that we've nailed our why, but in actually activating that and motivating that through the business, there's clearly a misalignment in that. And a lot of that will go back to one of the figures I didn't mention was the accountability. So where we talk about not just accountability in terms of performance, but accountability in terms of the behaviours that are modelled throughout the business as well. And the feedback on that was that accountability, only 27% believed that there was accountability and structures to actually drive accountability in organisations and decision making. So that really impacts on the whole organisation, as well as that level of trust and that level of respect around the boardroom table.
Yeah, very much. That's very interesting, actually. So I'm interested also because, we're going to talk a little bit more shortly about the process of the research, but what was one of the most surprising findings for you?
I think it was always the correlation. It was, and it sort of came later. I had all the data, and I had so much of it. It was coming out of my ears. I've got spreadsheet upon spreadsheet upon spreadsheet, and I think I mentioned to you that I sort of had that aha moment, and it was because I kept asking myself, so what and why, and I'm a really big advocate of evidence-based leadership. And so I kept saying to me, prove it. And so I sort of had to send a text to myself at all hours of the morning and went, you need to do a correlation analysis between those 2 points. And so I had done that, but as part of the research, I'd also asked a Net Promoter Score question, an advocacy question, because I love Net Promoter Score. I'm customer centric. I'm extreme. That's my background. So I wanted to have a look at that, and And so what I did is I asked our participants if they were likely to recommend the organisation in terms of the organisation Net Promoter Score, but also in terms of a future position in a leadership role, if the person was of the right, if all things are equal, where they're the right person, the right skill set and everything else, and there happened to be availability, would you recommend? And that was another direct correlation, so or a positive correlation of 61. And what that was basically very similar to the decision-making quality. So I could probably do another one on top of that, looking at the decision-making quality and advocacy. But what they said was our negative experience on these boards is actually turning us into a detractor. And so we actually are not promoting the organisation, but nor are we promoting the organisation to actually get good leaders and fill some of our boardroom roles. And I guess where I wanted to take that next was, does that mean that we're going to struggle in the future to get really great non-paid executive board positions because people are actually being negatively impacted in terms of their own experience? So why would I bother next time? If it's all so much effort and it's all this pain and heartbreak, why bother with it? But also it's having a negative impact on the organisation itself. So if you have one person that's a promoter, or let's say you've got 3 person that are promoting your business, but you've got one detractor, that one detractor will generally take away all those promoters. So so from an advocacy perspective, that was my big surprise. I had actually deleted the data, or putting it into the actual insights, and then when I was talking about the correlations, I went, why don't I just actually bring that back in and have a look and see if that's actually doing what you would think it would do. So that was good. And I think it was just, I was probably cognitively exhausted when I decided to get rid of it, like short of time, short of space, going, what do I need to do? I need to get rid of some figures here to make everything a lot clearer. And then it was just that, a little bit of time at night where you're a bit chill and you suddenly have those nice moments where you can actually de-stress, and all your great ideas come to you during those times.
To you. And you say, well, I'm glad you did decide to send that text message to yourself, because it's really interesting. And I know one of the kind of the big so what impacts of that, as you said, is in this environment we've got reducing numbers of volunteers, going for those unpaid positions. We've got, organisations, not-for-profits in need of good quality, board members. And if they're not going to come forward for the positions because either they've had a poor experience somewhere else, so they've now become a detractor generally about the experience of being on not-for-profit boards, or they're specifically saying to their peers, don't go to that organisation, you won't want to be on that board as a detractor, that's going to have a significant impact on even the pool of available candidates for those positions.
And we're looking at what's the talent that you're trying to attract and retain, and so are you retaining some of your less cognitively diverse board directors and leadership leaders on your team, or are you attracting the best? And then how are you going to actually bring in the best, or those that are more likely to be in tune with your values of the organisation and be able to help you grow if you can't get the best because of previous experience.
Yeah, that's great. And you sort of touched on it a bit before. I am interested in the risk side of, kind of driving up psychological safety, I suppose, the why organisations need to from a managing risk perspective. And I know you actually asked people about their obligations around it, and you found some interesting things.
It really threw me, actually. Because we're obviously doing a lot of education around workplace health and safety when we're going in and talking about psychological safety or psychosocial hazards. And mind you, I won't talk to it. I bring in legal experts to talk to it as we should. But the data showed that only 14%, I think it was 14%, only 14% of those that we actually interviewed and surveyed actually understood their WHS requirements in terms of psychosocial hazards. So that was a little bit startling, I think, in terms of and yet I think around 88% acknowledge that they do have a leadership and a role to play in driving culture. So
Wow.
it's kind of like, okay, well, how do you think you're going to do that if you don't understand what the psychosocial hazards are around that? So
yeah,
we're doing great risk.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say all their risk and what they're exposing their organisations to by not being clear on, their responsibilities from a legal perspective. So let alone from all the ones you've already raised around performance and quality and, culture, even just looking at that legal perspective, if that's, 86% who aren't clear on their obligations from a WHS perspective, that's very startling.
Yeah, and I don't know, it's 12 people that you're around the room sharing that responsibility for, and we've had organisations where they've been given the notice from a safe work, whether it be a Queensland and New South Wales. We've got them in every state, but here's notice, you could be up for a $660,000 fine to more than that, and then of course you've got manslaughter laws on top of that. So if someone is found to be an influence or a factor in someone taking their life and things like that, and then you've got a whole lot of different ways. But we've got Respect at Work at the moment too, where they're doing a lot of work around bullying, harassment, sexual harassment. I think Queensland only just recently had one of the highest payouts for sexual harassment in the workplace. So we're starting to get there a little bit in that whole Respect at Work focus, which is really good. But that's only a small amount of looking at what are some of the other psychosocial hazards that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. So of course, it's not all doom and gloom. You've got some opportunities for how to impact this environment. So I did notice that you had an interesting statistic that 46% of those who you queried said that the removal of at least one individual on the leadership team psychological safety would improve. So about half of people said, well, if you just got rid of that one person, we'd be better for it. So that's interesting that to show kind of the impact. And there's more to creating a safe environment, of course, than just moving someone on. So what are some of the elements? I know you would talk to people about what are the most important elements to them in terms of creating an environment of psychological safety. Can you tell us about some of those areas that will have most impact?
Yeah. It was really interesting and it went back to that motivation and intent, the 41% that believe, yes, that the organisation is actually, it is a priority to our making decisions. And then when we asked a little bit more about that, so you've almost got the opposite saying that no, personal interest comes first. But we also asked this question, and it was, it was prompted from a Brené Brown, which said, we don't come to work, intending to hurt people and to basically stuff up. We come with the best of intentions. So I asked that question and went, do you believe that your fellow board members have the best of intentions and come with the best of intentions too? And only 36% said yes. So I think it really comes back to that. And I think we tend to blame the personalities around the boardroom a lot, and therefore it's almost dismissed. It's an opportunity for dismissiveness, and that's probably one of the biggest issues that we have is this sense of dismissiveness around some of that. But others say no, it's more the facilitation. We need stronger facilitation of people being able to get the most out of everyone around that table, and usually that, of course, felt to the CEO in terms of leadership teams or the chair in terms of boards and committees. So that was actually quite good. About 70% basically said we need improvement around our communications and our people skills. When you had a look personally at some of those, I think a lot of people were saying, no, we've got great communication and people skills, but when you actually assess that from a colleague's perspective, I think it was, no, let's do more around this. Some awareness. Yes, I think if we looked at where some of those smaller ratings were, one of the things I found is that inability to be able to articulate a really common purpose for the organisation is what's causing so much conflict, and it's also allowing us to almost play the rules a little bit better and hide behind some of our constitutions, or behind some of the legalities that might not be, or processes and procedures that aren't put in place. So I think having that real clarity of purpose and understanding what the roles and responsibilities are, having very clearly defined metrics that aren't conflicting, is at least getting the roadmap right, and then working on some of those other things around your mindsets, around your building your trust with your teams and respect, and being able to, again, you know, if we've got great facilitation skills, then we can make sure everyone around the table is feeling like they're being included. But that also goes back to mitigating a lot of the biases that we have, you know, and I think so many examples were given, and it was my experience as well, that you come in with a degree and they pigeonhole you as that degree and that experience, and when you try to step outside of that, it's a bit too hard and a bit too scary to do that. So let's just keep you in your pigeonhole. So one of the boards that I was on, I was really keen to learn the governance or people and culture. But because I have a marketing background, I'm always put into the marketing and asked to do or chair a marketing committee, which I don't mind ever doing. But do I find that meaningful, and do I find that full of purpose, and is that really going to buzz me? Sure, in a short term, but it's kind of routine now. Where I would like to spend more time is how can we actually get the most out of our people, which means a people and culture. But again, on a lot of boards, that just forms part of an overall governance, you know, responsibility, as opposed to actually pulling that out as a committee that needs to look at that separately. So time, effort, and you know, becomes an issue.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually, and something I hadn't thought specifically about. But of course, when we're looking at boards and then committee structures, often at the board level, you're looking at diversity. You know, there's a kind of general, there can be a deliberate finding of people with certain skill sets and backgrounds, etc., which is what you're talking to. But then when you go and hive off into committees, it tends to be specialised. So you'll be you know, you're the CPA, so you'll go and run the audit committee. You're the marketing, so you'll go and run the, you know, marketing of, you know, the fundraising often type committees. And if you're not getting that diversity there, then actually your decision making at the committee level is, you know, that's the place to impact it, isn't it? If you're making actual decisions about audit and things. So yeah, it's a really great point. And I can see, you know, the other side of that too is you're someone there who wants to contribute, and you're saying, I've got a lot I could contribute, in fact, across all these areas. And they're saying, no, please just stick with the marketing. Thanks. Yeah,
That's it.
Thanks for sharing that personal insight. It's very helpful. So we've talked a bit about this in previous weeks too. I know everyone's always interested in sort of what can they do? What can I do as a leader? Or, you know, what can we do to sort of encourage some of those environments? I know you sort of talked, you know, strategically at those, that sort of what can impact the organisation. What are some of the things that individual leaders, we're just talking really sort of simple tips that they could put in place?
You know, the whole thing that got me interested in psychological safety was when about 3 years ago I met a woman called Linda Ray from Neurocapability, who was talking about the impact of neuroscience on your leadership. And for me, as an individual, as a parent, as a founder, as a CEO, as an advisor, to me, that's probably one of the greatest things that you can upskill in that emotional and social intelligence, and just understanding yourself and how you lead. That's probably for me, understanding that, and then the impacts then on how I perceive things around a boardroom table or around in a social setting, what potentially will throw me into a threat response or or a reward response. And if I understand that, then I can actually go, you know, is that a comment that's being made? You know, is it a personal comment? I don't think it is. Actually, you're just responding personally. It's actually, there's validity around what they're saying. So how can we actually take the personality and the person out and actually start being more curious and question a lot more? So it's really hard to do that unless you have some of that emotional intelligence behind you, I think. So to me, understanding some of that, and there's some great books. David Rock's book goes into a lot of detail, who's Neuro Leadership Group, but Linda Ray's course too on neurocapability. To me, that's a really great starting point.
And I know you also looked at sort of the things to stop, which you mentioned some of those there. So self-interest and ego, you know, and it's challenging, I guess, to know, how do I stop that? How do I leave that at the door? I think, as you said, some of the ways that you can set up process, certainly my experience is having a process clear on how we're about to dive into making the decision before we start making it, means that even if I'm bringing my ego and bias in, it's going to get kind of tossed around through the process anyway. So that's I think, again, to your emotional intelligence point.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably a review of those processes as well. And I guess the other one is that accountability framework, you know, being really, really clear. When we went back and said, out of all the things that we've got going on here and where there are some gaps, what is actually the number one thing that you want us to work on? And I mean, obviously it was, you know, we just want to be treated fairly, and that came into, you know, having that respect and not being judged and being included and valued. But the second one was actually having the right behaviours and models. So despite the fact that only 8% said that our processes and procedures actually support what we're able to do and drive this accountability, it was almost one of the second last priorities for them, because at the moment what we want is treat us fairly, and then actually model the right behaviours. So that's going to be modelled later on through the organisation. So as two of those strong elements or factors to work on, that's where I would always be starting. And that's going to be different for usually each board, but certainly it's come through really strongly as two that have been consistently number one and number two. Yeah.
And the other one I'm going to add in there that I think we should all take on is to go and look up our obligations around WHS, because that's really pointing to a risk for a lot of organisations right now, I think.
Yeah, it helps to have a barrister as a husband that is in WHS, that continually, when you go to a board meeting or something, says to you, "That's our house on the line. That's our house on the line." So as I said, you know, I'm one of those people that went, you know what, can I actually do what I need to do here, and do I actually look at other options? And the way I could get that purpose and value was to actually look at more the advisory centre type of things, as opposed to the other. But absolutely.
And so it's a good point, actually. And I know we're getting short on time, as I thought, because we've got so much to unpack. So if anyone's got any questions that you'd like me to raise, if you can pop the questions in the chat, and I'll pose them to Carolyn shortly. Just while people are doing that, I'd love for you to share what had you start the research in the first place. And, you know, I guess there was decisions along the way in that. So you shared some of your midnight texting and you know, tossing around lots of data, but kind of why start it in the first place?
Yeah, so well, there's a couple of things. One was that I was on a board at the time, and it got to the stage where I was actually feeling physically sick just looking at the agenda items. I think at one stage, you know, as I mentioned, a lot of my background's customer centricity, and so I've gone into a lot of ASX businesses prior to being listed to review their net promoter score and their customer centricity. And what I found with this organisation I was working with is that they hadn't been actually measuring ours, but they'd been reporting it at a head office level as part of a competitive, you know, or a sustainable competitive differentiator. So I kind of started questioning it, going, you know, what's going on? So I did a paper to my board and to a national board to explain the way we should be doing it and what we needed to do to get this right. And but before it could go up, of course, my chair, so I think I must have reiterated it and rewritten it 5 times based on his asking. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, when I look at some of those intents, it was maybe it was a bit of personality, but maybe, yeah, I wasn't in the right frame of mind either to deal with it. So anyway, I went to a couple of refresher courses. So feeling that, you know, okay, this isn't going as well as I would like, I did go to a couple of AICD and Governance Institute refresher courses. And I just happened to be, you know, I've always got a pen in my hand normally and writing lots of notes. And I was running a little late, so I was kind of just trying to grab my breath and listen to what was going on around the room. And when I finished writing what I was just listening to, I just had this word toxic all over my sheet. And it was basically people talking about the people or the processes, whether to record minutes, whether to not record them, the inability for them to speak up, the inability for them to actually be heard, the way decisions were actually being made outside of the boardroom, whether it be on a golf course or a football field or within a committee that wasn't actually having full discussion. And it kind of just got me thinking, going, wow, that, you know, I'm not the only one feeling sometimes this level of anxiety prior to going into meetings. This seems to be all over the place. Yet when we did the refresher course, you know, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed in terms of we still don't reference customer. We reference a shareholder. We don't mention stakeholders. We didn't do one bit into how do we mitigate the bias within our decision-making boards? How do we actually facilitate better discussion? None of those things were actually addressed. We're still going back into what, you know, we're using the same case studies that we did 12 years ago when I first did my graduate in AICD. So I started just going, what can I do? So I started approaching some of those organisations to go, would you like to do a joint paper? Would you like to search me? And to be honest, it was the smaller independents, the women on boards, the Lisa from Board Australia and all these different other boards that actually were a lot more helpful and started promoting some of the psychological safety surveys and talking about it. And they were a lot more involved and going, yeah, this is an issue. We hear it all the time. And it was the continual stories. So I would tell people that I'm thinking of doing the research, and the amount of stories that I just got that were kind of saying, yeah, my experience was this, you know, you need to do this. There were very few that said, ours is doing it really, really well. Come and have a look, come and do this, and talk about how we're doing things.
And of course, there was a decision there, because I remember when you were telling me about it, you were thinking, oh, maybe someone else would do the research. Maybe.
Yeah. So I think it comes back to that imposter bias a little bit. So a number of years ago, I was looking at customer relationship and looking at what drives better engagement. And you know, I thought about it. I did the research. I actually did it with an MBA student from James Cook University as well. So it had, you know, it's had the right frameworks and things like that. And, you know, I was pipped by Ipsos, is that the huge global research company, by about 2 weeks in publishing my data. And of course, you know, I had 200 in my research. They had 4,000. So, but the thing that had delayed me so long was thinking, you know what, it can't have relevance. You know, if someone else and some of the bigger guys haven't come up with it yet, then there's nothing there. There's nothing relevant there. There's nothing there to teach. There's nothing to learn. And of course, when I got picked at the post, I kind of went, oh, it sort of gave me a high, because I went, oh, it validates that maybe I'm not on the wrong path. But I was really frustrated with myself, because I saw it as a huge opportunity lost, I guess, in so many ways. So with this, I spoke to a number of people, and where they were focusing on organisation, they didn't really want to focus on board and leadership teams specifically. Yet that's where I play, that's where I work with the most. And, you know, we'd had so many commissions and inquiries, which are actually only continuing into different areas where, you know, the fish rots from the head, it's all the leadership. And I just started going, you know, we can continue to blame and we can continue to talk about this, but maybe what we need is actually better support materials. Maybe what we need is better help and assistance. So what can we do to do that? And the only way I thought I could get informed about it was actually to do the research myself. So yeah, I tried to get others to come in, because that would have made me feel better. But yeah, I didn't. So in the end, I did it myself. And yeah, so about 400 spreadsheets later, and I'm sure an absolute mess when I compare it to what universities might be doing. But alas, we've got it.
We've got it, and we've got you. So thank you so much for sharing all that today. I'm going to ask you one final question, and thank you, Lisa, for your point there around D&O liability insurance. She was just reflecting that your point made around the responsibility on decision making while sitting on board. So thank you. Very good reminder there. Carolyn, if you were to give one piece of wisdom to a woman interested in getting more involved in strategic decision making, what would that be?
I think surround yourself with like-minded women. As I said, you know, one of my earliest experiences and best interaction was with Babette, who was brilliant, and I'd probably had 3 leaders that were females before that, but she was probably the most outstanding. So I think reaching out to people, I think, is and creating this really great, you know, group of women. So I think, you know, your wisdom, I think, is a great place to do that. And I think just read up. I used to think you had to be an expert to be able to do things. I would never have done this research if I thought I had to have expertise. And certainly going to the universities, they're telling me that I have to have expertise. I have to go back and do a master's in research to validate the research, and maybe I will do that. But, you know, I just got this thirst, and I just went, if there's still a gap by the time I've done all my research, then I'll keep doing it. And I follow the greats. I follow the Amy Edmondsons. I follow the Kahns, the Steins. I go back to research, you know, into the 1960s to see what it is that I might have missed, or to interpret something differently. So I think just, you know, never say it ends. I think just have this unquenchable thirst to keep going and keep asking.
Good. Well, I suspect this might be the last time we talk, because you've got so much more, and I think that's only part of your research that we've unpacked today anyway. So there's more conversations to have in the future. Thank you so much. I can see comments coming through. We didn't get time to do many questions because we were so intent as well, but I do commit to everyone, I'll be sharing Carolyn's email address with her permission after this session. So for everyone on the call, so you can reach out to her and get access to more of that information as well. Thank you so much, and we'll continue the conversation. Next fortnight, we are welcoming Gillian Formenton. So she's the Business Development Manager at Cloud Group, and she was the WA Division Engineers Australia President for the last year. She's going to come and talk to us. She says great decision making is less about stopping bad things happening and more about harnessing collective wisdom and passion to create an event together. So please come and join us. Everyone who's on the call today will be registered in advance. So my request to you, my invitation is please share it with others. I know Gillian will be up for creating just as interesting a session as we've had today here with Carolyn. So do share that with people, and I'll be sending the information around following today. So thank you all for joining. Thank you for participation. Great to have you here, Carolyn, and I look forward to continuing the discussion. Join the LinkedIn group if you haven't.